This is stage 7. Something like 7.61 miles. This is a 120, left 5 minus, over small crest long, opens very long.
You're still quite loud.
30 seconds.
So, as long as you're conversational on stage. Oh, we're still on transit. Okay, sorry.
No, we're not.
Okay, that's better.
Testing 1, 2, testing.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. 15 seconds. 10. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go! Left 5 minus over small crest, long, opens very long. 180. Right 6 over small crest, long, tightens opens over small crest. 50. Left 6 very long over small crest, 70. Crest. Repeat 70, crest, right 4 over crest, off camber, opens, tightens, 50. Small crest, 70, right 5 plus long. 8, small crest, 70, right 5 plus long, 50. Small crest, into right 6, 150. Left 6 plus, 150.
Next.
Brake, left 3 plus, late, very long. Small crest, 120. Left 6 plus over small crest, into right 6 plus over small jump, 150. Right 6, tightens, opens, long over crest, tightens 5 over small crest, long. Into right 5 plus over small crest, very long, 50. Long small crest 40, left 4 minus, open, stay in. Left 6 plus over small crest, into right 5 plus, long small crest, into right 5 plus, opens, long. Brake, left 3 plus, long. Into right 5 plus long, 50. Right 6.
Next.
Into left 5 minus, tightens 4. Small crest, into left 6 plus, 70. Stay right over small crest, 50. Left 6, 50. Small crest, left 5 short, into right 6. Left 5 plus, 50, right 5 minus, very long, tightens 4 plus, tighty. Right 6 plus, long, 70. Right 4 plus, long, opens. .50 small crest into left 6 plus. Right 6, 180. Right 6, 100. Small crest into right 5 plus, long. Left 6 plus over small crest into right 6, 70. Left 5 opens over crest into right 4 plus. Small crest into right 5 over crest opens. Left 6 tightens over small crest 50. Left 4 plus over crest into right 5 minus down 70. Caution left 3 plus into right 4 plus short over bump over bridge, tightens 3. Into left 4 minus, narrow tighty, opens over small crest 50. Turn left 4 plus long, into turn right 5 plus short. Into crest left 5, 70. Left 6, long 100. Right 6 over small crest 50. Crest break 50, right 3 plus 70. Small crest, right 6 plus 50. Stay left over crest 70. Stay left over crest into right 6 plus down 50. Left 5 plus. Right 5 minus. Left 6 plus. Right 6 over small crest opens long into long crest 50. Left 5 plus over small crest. Right 6 tightens long. Left 6 plus. Left 5 plus over small crest. Long over crest 50. Left 6 over crest 50. Left 5 plus long, tightens 70. Left 4 plus late, loose. Into right 6, 50. Makes your late, loose. Left 4 plus. Right 6, 50. Right 6. Into left 5 plus over crest. Into right 5 plus long, 50. Left 6, 120. Left 5 minus. Into right 5 minus off camber over small crest, long over small crest. Left 5 plus long, 50. Left 6 plus 70. Right 5 plus. Left 6 plus. Left 6 plus over small crest. Into right 6 plus, 100. Left 5 minus, tightens 4 plus. Into right 3 minus. Into left 4 plus. Over crest, tightens 50. Right 3 loose over finish. Long opens over small crest. Good job. You're done.
Damn, that's fast stage.
It's fun though. 8.